Welcome everyone to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Moeller, represent Secretary Jamie Kessler here. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you have one. Please do not unmute and mute yourself. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Jonathan Church via the chat box at jchurch@ctps.org or call him at 857-702-3709. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Jonathan Church of the MPO staff at jchurch@ctps.org or call him at 857-702-3709. Kane, I believe you're calling the roll, maybe? Is that right? Or Jonathan, is it you?
I'm calling the roll, Mr. Chair. So
When you're ready.
doing multitasking today. MassDOT Chair.
Is David Moeller? I'm here.
MassDOT Seat 2.
Marie Rose, Director of Project Management, sitting in for John Bouchard, Deputy Chief Engineer.
Thank you. MassDOT Highway Division.
John Romano here.
Thank you. I know we received an email. The MBTA will not be present today, so I will skip over to Massport.
Not seeing Massport here just yet.
Okay. MAPC. Someone unmute Eric.
Is Eric here right now?
I'm actually not seeing Eric at the moment.
Oh, okay. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board present.
Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins Advisory Council here.
City of Boston, Boston Transportation Department. Okay. City of Boston, BPDA.
Oh, no, I think actually BTD is here. Just maybe having an issue with the unmuting. We've got Matt Moran here.
Yeah, Matt Moran is here for BTD.
Okay.
I don't know if he's figured out the unmuting yet, but anyway, I'll go first. Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA, representing Mayor Wu and City of Boston.
Okay, thank you. I will come back to BTD. At large, City of Everett.
Not seeing Jay.
Okay. At large, City of Newton.
David Kozis, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the city of Newton.
At large, Town of Arlington.
Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, representing Select Board Chair Len Diggins and Town of Arlington.
Thank you. At large town, Town of Brookline.
Heather Hamilton for the town of Brookline.
Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning. This is Brad Rawson, representing the City of Somerville, the MAPC Intercore, and Mayor Tatiana Valentine.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
I don't think I'm seeing town of Acton here.
Okay. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Not seeing Dennis.
Okay. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Nguyen here for the City of Beverly and North Shore Task Force.
Thank you. North Suburban Planning Council, Town of Burlington.
Melissa Tantakis for North Suburban Planning Council.
Thank you. South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland.
I'm not seeing Jen Constable here.
Okay. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
Town of Medway, Peter Pelletier.
Thank you. Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Regional Chamber. Somebody unmute Tom O'Rourke.
Might be a technical snag here. So maybe come back to Tom.
Okay, I'll come back to Tom. I'll go back to the list. MAPC.
Good morning, Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. We'll go back to City of Boston, BTD. Could somebody unmute Matt Moran?
I'm not sure what the issue is, but Matt Moran seems to have an issue with unmuting. I can say that he is here. I will chat with him and see what the issue is.
Okay, thank you. Why don't I go to our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration?
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway.
Thank you. And Federal Transit Administration. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Jonathan. See if you can get Tom O'Rourke unmuted during the meeting at some point. Chair's report, I don't have one. Tegan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to thank everybody for your time and coming to these 2 MPO meetings in a row, I guess per week in a row. And also I wanted to say thank you to my staff who do have to put in a lot of effort to sort of manage the logistics when they're back to back like this. I do think it's very worthwhile to be here, and we have kind of 2 really main presentations today, 2 really great presentations. So I'm looking forward to it. And I can be brief. I did want to give you a couple of highlights around outreach and communications that we have going on. First of all, the public comment period for the federal fiscal year 23 to 27 TIP, which you voted to release last time. That comment period began on May 2nd and extends until May 23rd at 5 p.m. So we are trying to reach folks proactively. Matt Genova will be leading 2 virtual open houses, and he'll provide summary of the tip, get feedback and answer questions from people who are there, hopefully numerous stakeholders and members of the public. So please do feel free to share those out broad to your cities and towns, subregions, whatever works for you. We would really appreciate it. They're scheduled May 10th at 12:30 and May 18th at 5:30, and we'll post links and there'll be more information so that it makes it easy for you to forward that. Then also, I believe I mentioned this last time, but we want to remind you that the next Transit Working Group quarterly meeting will be on May 31st at 1 p.m. And again, we'll put some registration information in the chat. And we now know what the topic will be, or some of the main presentations will be, and that will be from the town of Lexington and the 128 Business Council on transit mapping and regionalization. And then also from the MassDOT Rail and Transit Division about innovative grant-funded RTA projects. As always, Sandy Johnston is your contact for these, and please do register and join us. Another item that has come out to you, I hope just now this morning, is that our contacts in the region should have just received an email from Jonathan Church, which has a link to a survey. And that survey is about gathering information about municipalities' interest and questions around the discretionary funding programs in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So it was sent out to 97, all of the 97 municipalities, and we were asked to do so by MARPA, which is the Massachusetts Association of Regional Planning Agencies, as well as the Transportation Managers Group, or the TMG. So we sent this out. We hope that we'll get a lot of information back. Again, please try to help spread the word to give us some responses to this so we can gather that information, and the deadline will be on Friday, May 13th. So that's the bulk of what I wanted to say. Just today we have, like I said, 2 really exciting presentations. And both of them, I think, are pretty central to the work that the MPO does to advance their goals around making a more equitable, sustainable, and safe transportation system. And those will be Drashti Joshi's presentation about the MPO's trip generation rate research, and then also an MBTA and consultant presentation about the new bus priority and reliability toolkit. So I'm looking forward to those. And finally, our next MPO meeting will be scheduled on May 26th. That is a slightly different schedule than the normal first and third, so please make a note of that. And it is on that timing so that we can have the vote for the endorsement of the 23 to 27 tip, among other items. And that is it, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan? Seeing none, the next item on the agenda is public comments. Is there anyone from the public who would like to comment at this time? Seeing and hearing none, if you want to comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we will call on you. Next item is committee chairs reports. Brian, I think A&F met, right?
Yes, David, thank you. Yes, the A&F committee just met before this one to begin the process of meeting the charge of this board to create an operations plan for the MPO and its staff and many affiliates. We had a good sort of high-level discussion, and we will continue that process. The committee will next meet on 5/19 with a tentative meeting on the morning of the 26th pending the UPWP committee. And just to say that anyone is welcome to join us at these. They are very informal. They're more of a discussion than sort of what we do here, which is very bureaucratic, but it has to be because we're the government. So everyone is welcome, and thank you, David, for the opportunity to say that.
Thank you, Brian. Any questions for Brian? Seeing none. Next item is the regional transportation.
I think Brad has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Brian. Brad, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Brian, thank you to you and members of the A&F committee. Brian, you mentioned that all are welcome and encouraged. Is there anything you can say to reiterate that? We have some new members of this board. We know that at times we are all stretched to attend regular meetings, let alone subcommittee meetings. And I think one of our shared goals here that will be articulated in the operations plan is continuing to reduce barriers so that all around the region and in all sub-regions, we get useful and context-specific participation from all members of this board and all of our constituents. Is there anything else that you can kind of offer up as a commercial for those meetings and beyond to get more folks excited about volunteering their time to support this effort? Thank you.
So I will violate my personal policy of never speaking after Brad Rawson because you asked me a question. Because I can never be as eloquent as you, Brad. Yes, so everyone, just to say that this is really a very high-level discussion of what an MPO is, what an MPO does, and what we as the Boston MPO do, and what really we should do. We should be doing based on not only the federal congressionally mandated regulations, but also the goals of this region and the goals of the municipalities that form this region. So if you're sort of interested in finding ways to elevate and amplify your voice and that of your community and that of your region, this is a good place to do it because we will be discussing exactly how to do that and under what means and ways that we can do that.
Thank you, Brian. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, there's nothing to report in terms of more meetings since our last meeting, but in advertising our upcoming meeting, we will be discussing the UPWP, and that'll be before the subcommittee of the MPO meets on the following day. So if you want to get a jump on that, please join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next item on the agenda is the approval of MPO minutes for March 31st. Can I get a motion and a second from a member? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Brian Kane.
Mr. Chair.
Brian, I didn't hear you. Did you say you moved in minutes? I didn't hear you say anything.
Move approval.
Thank you. Daniel Epstein.
Daniel Amstutz seconds the motion.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Are there any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions?
Mr. Chair, just one quick note. This is Matt Moran from the Boston Transportation Department. I just want to note that I'm present here representing the city of Boston and Mayor Wu. Sorry for the technical issue earlier.
No worries, man. I'm glad it got fixed. So on the motion, please call the roll, Jonathan.
David Moeller,
Yes.
Marie Rose,
Maybe circle back, Jonathan.
okay, John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Matt Moran,
Matt Moran, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Brad Rawson,
Brad Rawson, yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Melissa Tintakoulis,
Melissa Tintakoulis, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
And Tom, since we now have your audio fixed, could you just call the roll that you're present for here as well?
Yes, I am present. Thank you.
Thank you. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is a presentation on trip generation rate research study by Drashti Joshi. Drashti, when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. My name is Drashti Joshi, and I'm a senior transportation modeler in the Trial Model Applications Group. Today, I'm here to present our findings from the federal fiscal year 2021 UPWP study on trip generation rate research. So today, what I'm going to talk about is what we did as part of the trip generation rate research study. I'll give you the introduction of the project, and then I'll talk about the state of the practice that we have researched, some of the development comparisons that we have analyzed as a part of this work, and in the end, next steps and lessons learned as a result of this work. So let's look at the project background. What is trip generation? Trip generation is a number of trips generated by a particular development or land use. Trips per square foot or any other measurable quantity like number of employees, number of dwelling units, that is the trip generation rate. According to MEPA, any proposed land use development project over certain traffic and environmental threshold, which involves state or federal land, fund, or action, is required to prepare a traffic impact analysis. This requires an estimation of total trips generated by the development. And so it is commonly used in development review process. So while going into the study, these were our main purposes for this study. The first purpose was to understand ongoing research in this field and to look at what other states MPOs are doing in terms of research in this area. The second purpose was to better understand accuracy of projected trips on local projects. So there are these MEPA filings that has the projected trip generation for any proposed developments based on ITE rates. And once the developments are completed, there are these traffic monitoring reports that Mass DOT has collected. So one purpose is to compare observed data against what the MEPA filings were, to see whether the forecasted trips for MEPA filings are close to what is observed in the field. Another purpose was to use lessons learned from this research to enhance our Boston Region MPO travel demand model to better support MPA studies. And then create a framework for ongoing research and efforts into developing improved methods at local and state level. So to give you an idea about the key findings from the analysis we carried out in this study, this is the overview of summary of findings. So like executive summary. So we found that the trip rate range for retail only developments is highly variable. The transit accessibility explains fewer vehicle trips, and if not taken into consideration, it leads to overestimation of vehicle trips. The parking constraints suggest strong impact on vehicle trips. The household characteristics consideration contribute to achieve better accuracy in trip generation. And what type of mix is in the mixed use development has effects on the results variability. And area type has an important impact on different land uses. So in next couple of slides, once I explain the analysis, I will go in detail about these findings again in the end. So this is the introductory part of the study. Now, I will talk about some research we reviewed for this study. So this section also ties back to the previous federal fiscal year 2020 UPWP study on innovations in trip generation conducted by MPO staff. So as we discussed in the purpose, we looked into ongoing research and reviewed some of the state of the practice in this field. And these are the key areas we looked into. So vehicle trips. For vehicle trips, we reviewed IT trip generation manual and handbook to look at this. Currently, the ITE-based trip generation is what MPA requires for doing site impact analysis. And we had contacted ITE at the beginning of this process to understand what some of the research is that they are doing. Using the IT trip generation manual for forecasting trip generation is the standard practice and most widely used method to determine trip generation rates for new developments. IT contains trip generation data points from years 1980 to 2017. And the data found in the IT trip generation manual are based on vehicle trips in suburban settings with distinct land uses. During this research, latest IT edition available for reference was 10th edition. IT also published the new trip generation handbook to deal with the mixed use development trip generation. One of the important points here is that the IT book is based on driveway counts. So these are auto trips going in and out of the site, not person trips. Person trips are more important in urban areas because those areas are served by transit. So in urban areas, the IT rates may be over predicting. Then we also looked into mixed use developments and internal capture area too. Another research we looked at is EPA mixed use trip generation. And there are two other recent NCHRP planning reports. EPA developed a mixed use trip generation model. This model was developed in recognition of the shortcomings of standard IT method of estimating traffic for site development. It is an open source spreadsheet tool that calculates reductions in trip from the standard methodology for mixed use developments. The NCHRP reports describes the analysis of internal capture relationship with the mixed use developments. Then we also reviewed some work in the person trips and mode choice area. So another trip generation method is use of household travel survey data. So household travel survey data is main input to the travel demand forecasting models, which are used for some regional trip generation practices to better improve the regional trip generation process that we use. So some research in that area is done as well, which we have reviewed. And then there is this Virginia DOT survey. which describes the diversity of methods used by different MPOs and DOTs in this research area. So as part of our research, we discovered that the Virginia Department of Transportation has actually conducted a nationwide survey of other state DOTs to see what those other DOTs and MPOs are doing in the way of generation rates. A total of 31 states responded to the survey. Different questionnaire focuses on what version of IT manual is used, alternative methods to IT trip rates, state-specific trip generation rates, internal capture, and mixed-use development handling practices, etc. It was interesting to find that there were 2 states, California and Texas, who are actively developing their own trip generation rates and using it. So that was the overview of the literature review piece that we conducted. I think it shows us that this is an ongoing process. Both ITE and the research from other states shows that this is ongoing research. People are doing quite a bit of work in this area to improve the state of the practice. So now in this section, we will look at the selected regional developments in Massachusetts and trip generation analysis we carried out for them. So this next part of the analysis was to try and take into consideration the trial monitoring data that Mass DOT has collected for regional developments. So when a development comes into MPA and they go through the MPA process of computing the impacts associated with their site using IT trip generation rates, they predict traffic coming in and out of the site by time of day and daily vehicle traffic. Once when the project is completed, as a requirement of that permitting, these developments have to monitor with traffic counters how much traffic is actually going in and out of the site. So Mass DOT has quite a few of these traffic monitoring reports that get submitted to them on a regular basis. So going into this study, we felt that we can pick a sample of those reports that are available for observed traffic in and out of these sites versus what was originally predicted. As part of selecting these completed development projects, with help of experts in this area, we came up with 9 regional developments. We tried to get a good cross-section of developments in terms of size, type, and setting. So this map shows the location of these 9 developments across the state. You can see these developments are across the state, not concentrated specifically in only one area. They all have MPA filings with predicted traffic, and they also have traffic monitoring reports now that they are completed, showing what the actual volumes are going in and out of the sites by time of day and daily. The color coding on this map is based on the new area types from model, like CBD, urban, rural, etc. I will go into detail of this little later in upcoming slides. This is to just show the location of selected 9 developments. So as you look at these developments, certainly they range in size from being large to some small ones in here too. But there is a range of land uses. As you can see, we have selected office, warehousing, residential, retail, mixed use in a way of Hingham Shipyard project, and a lot of different commercial land uses such as Chestnut Hill Square. So looking at all of the observed trial monitoring reports, these were the 9 that we selected that we were actually going to go through and compare. So this graph shows comparison between what was projected against what the counts show. So these are interesting graphs. The one on the left shows average weekday volume. The purple line is what was filed with MPA in terms of daily traffic volumes. And the orange line is what is in the trial monitoring reports. So that were submitted to Mass DOT. You can see by looking at this that in all cases, the estimated trips are greater than what has been observed. One important point here to note is development occupancy here. It plays an important role. When we were doing this comparison, the level of occupancy associated with these developments was not always known. And in ITA manual, the underlying assumption is that the project is 100% complete and 100% occupied. So in reality, it could be that they aren't. And that's something that we think can contribute to overestimation on projected trips. So as we move forward, trying to understand and define the trip generation process, we might have to look at in more detail. So there's the figure on the left. The figure on the right is a little different, and it's trying to show us how different percentage-wise the observed is based on what is projected. So the orange bars are the observed volumes that are obtained from the trial monitoring reports. And the purple line is the percent difference between projected and observed. So one thing that you can glean from this graph is that the smaller the project, the greater the difference between the projected and observed rates. As you can see, the Binney Street project has the lowest amount of volume associated with it, has the highest percent difference between projected and observed, almost 150% difference between what was originally predicted and what is observed. And then one of the largest projects in terms of traffic volume, Chestnut Hill Square, this shows the opposite. As the project gets larger, the discrepancy between projected and observed is less. And you can see that this Chestnut Hill project is only around 10% over predicting compared to what was observed. So it's pretty close. So this was an interesting finding when we were looking at both the traffic monitoring reports and what was originally filed with MPA. So we just looked at the graphs showing trends for observed versus projected trips. So drilling down a little bit into peak hour comparisons between projected and observed. If we look at the last column in the table, it shows the variability for different types of projects like Binney Street, Campanelli Business Park, Mansfield Crossing have high degree of variability, while Meadowwalk, Chestnut Hill Square, Southfield have low gap between projected and observed. So that was an interesting finding when we drill down into this table at peak hour and daily level comparisons. And so as we try to come up with some summary characteristics from this research, things that we feel might need to look at more detail going forward are these items. And I gave you a snapshot of these in introduction as well. So the retail only developments, the trip generation rates are highly variable for retail. And so this is something that needs quite a bit more research. Maybe retail is a too broad a category for us to be using in our analysis. And the Walmart and Mansfield Crossings are two projects we looked at, which were retail only. Another important finding is transit accessibility. We don't know how many walk trips are associated with these developments. Why projected is higher? Because ITA mainly provides vehicle trips only, and that could also be a reason. So transit accessibility is something we have to focus more on and maybe looking at the person trips in a lot more detail. So convenient access to transit explains fewer vehicle trips, while less convenient access to transit may explain more vehicle trips. And the example projects are that Binney Street, Hingham Shipyard, Chestnut Hill Square, Meadowwalk. Another finding is parking constraints have strong impact on vehicle trips. And the Binney Street in Cambridge is an example project for that one. In terms of household characteristics and estimating trip generation, we found that the detailed housing characteristics like number of workers, household size, number of vehicles in a household, income of the household members in the development allows us to use better trip generation rates and have a better process of forecasting. On mixed-use developments, the type of mix in the mixed-use developments may have an effect in variability of results accuracy. In the example projects are the Meadowwalk and Hingham Shipyard projects we looked at. We also found that the area type is an important factor as well. So area type setting like urban, suburban, rural have an impact in relation to different type of land uses. Certainly, if a development is close to transit, like commuter rail or rapid transit, the walk trips are going to be high. But in the ITE, vehicle trips are going to be higher. So area type is important, and maybe as a part of our work, we have to start analyzing our data based on area type, based on transit accessibility to truly reflect our regional area types and transit availability. So these were the key findings from this analysis. And now let's look at the implementing lessons learned from this. So as we were going through this analysis, we felt that more and more proper area type was having an important impact on trip generation rate. So as part of this project work, we started to try and break our data into level of transit accessibility and densities. And through the work we have done on this project, we have tested some stratification of the trip generation data by these density levels, the high, medium, and low densities, and by accessibility to transit. So in the trial demand modeling work, we have identified these density levels and accessibility to different transit stations associated with our transportation analysis zones. So as part of this project, we did reevaluate the densities, and we have come up with a new process for the trial demand model to use these transit accessible densities. So this map is the intersection of transit service and densities is shown in this map. You can see here, the map shows the downtown Boston area going out as far as Worcester in trial demand model. And these new area types that we would be testing and using going forward with trip generation model. So this is what it looks like after applying the new definitions to our transportation analysis zone system. There are 6 different area types you can see here based on transit accessibility and density of the zone, like CBD, highly accessible by transit, then dense urban, urban, fringe urban, suburban, and rural. And then where we are going from here, the next steps for us. So we want to do more work with the new transit accessibility density map that I have just shown you, possibly reprocessing the household travel survey data with better understanding of transit accessibility. In terms of employment, the current model only has 3 different employment categories. And with the new upgraded model, we are planning to use 10 different employment categories to try and get a much better handle on the trip generation rates for different types of employment. And I would also like to mention that these 10 categories are what MAPC uses for their urban sim model. So if we use same, we can be consistent with the land use inputs we receive from MAPC and feed into the model. Vehicle or parking constraint. So we are looking more at trying to take vehicle constraint consideration into the generation process and eventually the mode choice process. So TDM23, which will be an updated version of the trial demand model for LRTP 2023, it should be in a better position to help with the analysis of these projects because it is more sensitive to some of these things that we have highlighted through this research. But again, this is not a topic that is far from over. We feel that this generation study just pointed us in direction where we have to do more work and gave us better ideas as to how we may process the data that we have. And in the end, I would like to thank specifically all these people for contributing their time and knowledge during this research. Lionel Lucian, Alison Felix, Martin Ilkowitz, Ed Bromwich, Ben Dowling, and Rebecca Morgan. With that, I'll try to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Drashti. Questions from the members? Brad Rawson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Drashti, and the entire staff team at CTPS and partner agencies like MAPC and MassDOT. I'll probably have a series of questions, but I don't want to dominate the microphone, Chair. So let me just start by saying, from our standpoint as transportation planners in municipal government, managing the incredibly hot real estate development market in our community is a major element of staff time that we are asked to deploy. And if we don't prioritize scrutinizing development applications and review, I think that we have the risk of communities in a region of getting all of the downsides of new investment without appropriate mitigation or without guiding the private sector to invest in our community's priorities. We can't do this stuff on our own. We sometimes rely on consultants who either work for the private sector or for us as public servants. But we also rely on our state agency partners and regional partners. So thank you, MPO staff. I feel that this technical report helps us do our job better. I think that it helps us guide our limited staff time to review private redevelopment planning as well as public infrastructure planning. So just kind of as a introductory statement, Chair, I just wanted to say that this is really important to us, and I hope that it's important to other members of the board and of the MPO region. I feel that we all have a lot to learn in this space, and this technical work will help us do so. And I'm actually really looking forward to getting a sense from you all about where we go with the next UPWP study that will build on this work. So why don't I pause for there? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Brad. Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Drashti, for that presentation. I think this is incredibly interesting, and really appreciate all the work that has gone into it. And it's a very complex, complex set of factors to try to project, trips from a particular development. One question in particular is just from my understanding. So on the table that you have about the development details from the transportation monitoring report, I guess it's table 2, and you've got these various projects, and they have there's a column about the size and the development type, and there's different square footage or seats that are associated, or units that are associated with it. So I guess I'm a little confused. Is that are these things sort of being added together in a sense, in terms of like, is that have to do with because there are different sort of different elements that are being, like the trips are being calculated based on these different factors, and I guess it's like a mix of different uses. And I guess maybe I don't quite understand as much as to how, when you do have something like the Hingham Shipyard, which has several different types of sort of a wide mix of different uses, like how does that get, how do those trips get estimated? Like, is that, so that's what I don't quite understand, is in terms of the size and how those are, why that's broken out for that one as opposed to some of these other ones.
So this the specification about the development is from the trial monitoring reports we estimated. And yes, for each separate development, like by if it's a restaurant or residential component or an employment retail component in that Hingham Shipyard, then IT has a different land use codes for each of those one. And so the person who is estimating trips, they have to go and estimate the trips for each of those components and then combine them as a total trip generation by that project. For model also, it works similarly. We have to do the employment, like by if it's a retail component, service component, then the trips generated by those components as well as the residential component. So they will calculate it separately and combine.
Yeah, except that there's also internal capture. I mean, yes, but it's not just we add them together. We then add them together and do some discounting for things like internal capture. You know, you're at the Hingham Shipyard doing your retail shopping, and you're going to stay and have dinner. That's one trip, not two. So yeah, we combine them, but there is then massaging of the numbers to account for mixed use development type situations.
Okay, I think that, yeah, so I guess and you're saying, so that's partly how it was reported from the monitoring report, like for these, because I guess like Binney Street is just an office but Hingham Shipyard is all these other things. So that's partly how it's being reported as well.
Yeah. Monitoring report has the traffic counters, so they only calculate the vehicle trips, which will be compared with going in and out of the site. But as David said, internal capture will remain inside the site.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Sure.
David Kozis.
Okay, good. Good information. Thank you. I just had one clarifying question. So when we're comparing the number of trips that are projected for when the project's fully built out, right, with the number of trips that are, actually counted, when the project is built as it is now, right, which might not be fully built out yet. Or is that what we did, or is there some sort of reduction that was taken if the project is not fully built out? Or, in other words, once the project is fully built out, would we have a chart that would show that the predicted number of trips might actually be lower than the number that was actually counted, but we don't know yet because the project's not built out yet?
So what I just showed is all these projects are completed, and that's why we have monitoring reports, because once they are complete, they have to monitor what the traffic is going in and out. And what you said is the development of occupancy. If we know, then it would not be 100%. So we have to adjust what was submitted, meaning predicted, which is assuming that everything is fully occupied. So we have to factor it down. That's not done here. This is directly from the report, the numbers you are seeing.
All right, so I guess you're saying that every project that was included is all of them are completely built out.
They are built out, but not, we don't know if they are fully occupied or not. But they are complete.
All right, okay, thanks.
Brad Russell.
Thank you, Chair. I think I just heard something that causes me to want to go back to something you said earlier in the presentation, Drashti, which is that the industry and the status quo has had an embedded bias towards motor vehicle trip estimation and accounting. And I want everybody who's listening and thinking about these issues to try to avoid slipping into that bias. We just talked about post-project evaluation, but the example that we used was motor vehicle trip counting. So, recall that we started this conversation talking about person trips, which is a much bigger universe of travel demand than just motor vehicle trips. And of course, the percentage of motor vehicle trips related to how many person trips are occurring is going to occur, be calculated based on all those variables we mentioned: internal capture, transit availability, mix of land use, affordability and price points, parking, right? It's all part of the equation. And I think it's going to be important for this board and for all of us working with this information to be very thoughtful about setting up post-project evaluation measures that can capture person trips, not just the easy thing that the industry knows how to do, which is putting traffic tubes and laser counters at intersections. In Somerville, we have a comprehensive plan adopted under Massachusetts law, and we have a climate plan that obligate our city to ensure that 75% of trips associated with new development are occurring via walking, biking, or mass transit, and only 25% of new trips occurring via motor vehicle. How do we manage that and account for it? One of the ways we do so is mandatory reporting of employee or resident travel surveys, so that the idea of travel diaries for new residents, new shoppers, visitors, or workers. So Joshi, I guess I'm wondering whether you can tell us all about emerging best practices in that space to ensure that we are not just relying on traffic counters for driving trips as we think about how to apply this research. Thank you.
Well, there are other models. When we did the literature review, there are bike ped models, and totally some of the states and MPOs gone totally based on the local trip generation and not doing the standard practice, what everyone else is doing, by collecting just exactly what I described, but I had a lower sample size by doing their own survey of specific land uses, gathering data and creating their own trip generation spreadsheet and asking developers to use that trip generation spreadsheet and not ITE. So those things have been reviewed.
Other questions? Marty, I assume you don't have a question, but go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I thought I'd just add to Drashti's answer there, and Brad, is raising up a really good point. And, in the summary I see from Drashti's work is a lot of the recognition in the new research around trip generation rates is moving beyond the vehicle trips and understanding the importance of these other factors. And so part of what this research is helping us get our arms around is when are the rates appropriate, right? So more of a simpler, more abstract representation of what we're trying to model, and when do we actually need a bigger association of sensitivities. And so here I'm referring to the travel demand model. So that's why a lot of the lessons learned, when we recognized, okay, we have a expected trend that estimating trips, before something's built and then something maybe is partially occupied, it's going to be a little higher, but where does that actually bump up and not really follow that trend? Let's dig in deeper there and use that as guidance to know, well, if we're going to then employ the travel demand model, let's try to build in more of those sensitivities and use this as a guideline to where we need to expand, enhance our tools to be able to do a better job around that. So we're certainly looking to leverage this research in the development of the new model, as well as kind of a validation check. And let's see how the new model, TDM23, would estimate trips from these and see, how are we doing there? And then roll that guidance back into, okay, here's a new development, with these kinds of attributes. What tool will give us the kind of insights that we need?
Any other questions? Brad Rawson.
Sorry, Chair, you can obviously sense that this is an area of passion, but also urgency for our community, and I think for the Inner Core and the entire MPO region. I'm curious as to whether you, Chair, or others at MPO staff and MEPC staff can describe some of the applications of this type of work in sub-area studies, district and municipal master plans or land use plans, corridor studies, project development, and not just limit people's imagination to the traditional model of like, okay, here's a private development hitting a MIPA threshold. I'm wondering about not only our LRTP, but also Mass DOT's capital plan, MBTA capital plan, as well as all of the other specific work that this board funds for our great staff at MPO to support local communities at the corridor, district, or municipal scale. So I just want to continue this conversation and get a sense from all of you as to where we apply this important work. Thank you.
Again, Marty, you want to talk about how this work will feed into other MPO work?
I don't know. I was hoping Marty was actually going to talk a little bit about the link to the modeling in the LRTP, and I managed to fill that space while he was unmuting. So let me let him go ahead.
I mean, certainly for the LRTP, you know, it is a regional perspective, but something that we can then window in to any level of detail, and it isn't just something that's either regional or very narrowly project focused. And I think that, you know, the best insights is sort of understanding those relationships at those different levels of kind of scope or granularity, if you will. And because, you know, as we move around a region, we can have some pretty different situations. So this is kind of tying into that area type that Drashti mentioned. So that area type was developed as part of this effort, and that's something we're using in estimating our models so that we can better distinguish between something and that is, you know, not just CBD, non-CBD, but the relationship with density and with transit accessibility. So it's an interaction of those two, seeing, you know, obviously a stronger tie to, or stronger correlation to mode choice, which then will give us a more accurate estimate of our person versus auto trips, or auto trips as a component of person trips.
Thank you. Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to reiterate what Brad Rawson said, and I wasn't going to do this, but since it's come up now 3 times, putting my municipal hat on for a second, there definitely is consultant capture of trip generation in terms of development, especially in the inner core, and in my experience here in Brooklyn, especially on the Boston border. And I guess I would just encourage CTPS to think boldly with this data. This is data that can be monetized and utilized for the benefit of cities and towns at a significantly reduced rate from what the private consultants charge municipalities. But certainly, you know, if it were possible somehow to require, you know, developments over a certain size to have to utilize the tool, you know, it's looking, you know, not only would it benefit cities and towns significantly in not having to rely on, you know, the third parties or independent private third parties that may or may not be independent. But it would also possibly, you know, help the bottom line of CTPS, which is something that, you know, we in the A&F committee are obviously care about too. So I guess I just want to encourage you to think broadly about this and don't let this end here. And you know, I would be interested in seeing if there was a way for you to come back in 6 months or something with you know, where this has gone, because this is too important to sit on a shelf. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure thing. Eric?
Yeah, no, I just want to say, you know, thank you, Brad, for those comments about the, you know, the application of this work. Absolutely. I mean, I feel like this is great work to be able to bring to, you know, lots of different planning work, like you said, sub-area planning. You know, we at MAPC, we've really focused on the role of parking in impacting sort of, you know, auto mode choice. And I think really understanding, you know, what's going on, you know, in terms of the trip generation of new development, and what can we do to move the needle on mitigating that with TDM, but it starts with getting the trip generation correct and what are the assumptions that go into this. And so this is adding to, I think, a body of research that helps us understand. First of all, I think that we're different than sort of the national rates that are being used. This is putting this more into context of Massachusetts and kind of the fact that we have higher amounts of public transit and density and mixed use development. So this is really, this is great work as a foundation. I think there's a lot of opportunity to build off of it. There is a proposed UPWP study to kind of go into a little deeper, looking at the relationship around, well, there's a body of work that we will be, that's proposed, that's looking at, that could look at the parking in relationship to lab space. And then there is a body of work that we approved the other day that's sort of looking at the relationship between parking and kind of auto usage and auto availability. So I think all of these things are kind of going together and helping us as a region have a richer understanding of the role of kind of development on trip generation and auto and traffic, and really being more nuanced and more thoughtful about how we're planning for that. So this is all good stuff.
Hey, Josh G or Marty, whoever, can I ask a question? So based just on the charts that were shown, is an overarching finding that we're overestimating traffic, we're overestimating trip generation, vehicle trip generation, regardless of type or community type? Like, I didn't see anyone where we weren't overestimating the number of vehicle trips.
Josh, do you want to go back up to those charts? I mean, I could say generally, yes, the occupancy factor is, I think, a big term that's responsible for that. So if we're going to estimate trip rates based on 100% occupancy, and then check it against something that's less than that we expect it to be biased, as an overestimate.
So where in this do I see occupancy?
If you could go up one more, Josh, to the actual figures. Yeah, so the line charts, yes. So David, if you look at the left chart, the orange is observed and the kind of dark blue is what was estimated.
Yes.
And so it's always higher.
Right.
And so again, that's kind of expected. And what we looked closer at is where is the jump, something that seems to be more than
right, but
just due to occupancy. Yeah.
So let me ask you. So again, where do I see occupancy on here? Because I think this goes to David Kozis's earlier question, right? If my purple is a projection of full build out, full occupancy, and you haven't reached full occupancy in any of these charts aren't really comparing apples and oranges, right? I haven't made an estimate of what would the vehicle trips be at 50% occupancy. I've made an estimate at 100%, right? So where is occupancy? How can I, as the average reader, figure out how much of this is affected by occupancy rates and how much of this is just we do a really bad job of estimating vehicle trips, and actually development produces fewer vehicle trips than anybody's estimating in Massachusetts, and we should take that into account.
Yeah, and my understanding, Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the occupancy was not always available, which is why we did not incorporate it in these figures.
Not all from all TMRs for all this project, not all the project had occupancy information, and so we couldn't create that column or create a factor where we can bring it down to adjust for it.
But you're right, David. It's an unknown variable that we know it would have a common effect across, right? The lower occupancy will always mean the trips will be biased higher, but we don't have the information that shows to what degree for each individual project.
Right. So there are two ways to look at this chart, right? One is forget occupancy for a minute, okay? I take your point, Marty, and none of my questions are to assume that staff didn't do exactly what they should have done and what was available. I think staff generally, and Drashti particularly, always does excellent work, okay?
Agreed.
But, so I could look at this, yeah, I'm sure you do. I can look at this in two different ways, right? The first is the focus on vehicles underestimates transit trips. And if you were looking at person trips, possibly the purple line is correct for purple trips, but not for vehicle trips, okay? But if I were a developer, I could also look at this and say, stop using ITE, use something else. Don't trigger me for MEPA for mini projects because I'm not actually producing vehicle trips. And by the way, I shouldn't have to mitigate vehicle trips because I'm not producing them. Right? I mean, I just don't know what to make of. It looks like we're always missing our estimates by a lot, right?
I mean, so some just initial reactions to that. I think those are really, on target comments, as always. But like Walmart, right? So that's an example where there is not transit accessibility. This is way out in, I think it's North Adams. So that's why, when Drashti was designing this sort of survey, we wanted to cover a lot of ranges so that we could try to isolate some effects. I mean, it's a very small sample as well, so we don't want to push it too far in our conclusions, just more like, okay, we're getting some indications here. But I mean, some of them are actually not that far off. They are all above the line, but it actually follows it pretty well, except for a couple of points. Certainly, we expect to have a higher percentage error for a lower estimate, but also it's going to have not that as much of an impact. The 150% error on Binney Street is a far smaller difference in real trips than the 20% error in Southfield, for example.
Right, but let's stay on the Walmart example for a second.
Sure.
And again, I won't necessarily just refer to Walmart. I'll refer to big box stores, right?
There we are.
Particularly this one, right? It's not located in the urban core. Nobody's taking transit to it. I have a question about whether people generally take transit to big box stores or not, but regardless, nobody's taking transit to this one. Seems to me that if this ends up being true, and again, this is just one sample of one type of one project, the question becomes, are we overestimating vehicle trips caused by big box stores? And when everybody says to us, oh my God, they cause so much traffic and you should be mitigating it, the answer seems to be, yeah, that's really anecdotal, it's not true. But I don't really believe that's the answer, but that's on one sample size, that's what it looks like the answer to me is. Right? I'm just concerned that this runs counter to some of the things I think we want to make sure we're doing, which is appropriately mitigating developments. And maybe it shows us that we're over mitigating and over estimating the impacts. I'm not sure. Eric?
David. Sorry, Josh, did you want to say something?
Yeah, to follow up on David's question, I just have two comments about the Walmart thing. And that's where that retail only development finding comes in, because IT has a very big range for retail, and consultant can, or anyone who is evaluating this can pick any number. It's starting from 3 point something to 206. That's the rate range. And so anything can be picked up and that will estimate the trip. So that's a retail only development. That's what we found out, that the trip range is very broad, and Walmart may be the reason for being higher for Walmart. That might be the reason. And for another point, there's Mansfield Crossing and Hingham Shipyard. So IT trip generation manual. So what we reviewed is 10th edition, most recent. But the previous edition has a tendency of overestimation for sure, that they have improved a lot in the 10th edition. And this Mansfield Crossing, Hingham Shipyard, if you see the observation here, they must have used the older versions. And that's what the Virginia Department of Transportation survey also says, the 10th edition is better compared to the previous versions. And so if the previous versions were used, it tend to overestimate. The prediction was overestimated.
Thank you, Darcy. Eric?
Yeah, I mean, David, going back a couple of years ago, right before COVID hit, and we've been having this conversation with CTPS for a while now about this work. We did a focus group with a number, I would say, 4 or 5 of kind of the top consultants that do a lot of this work, and they did admit to us that even after they take like a kind of a discount of trips, we're still overestimating trips anywhere from 25 to 40%, and particularly in like the sort of those kind of suburban sites where there's not a lot of public transit. And I think the challenge there is that that it can lead to mitigation that is overly focused on mitigating automobile trips, like adding turning lanes at intersections, and it's coming at the expense of pedestrian and bicycle improvements or safety. And so I think that is something for us to really think about, is getting these numbers right is important, because if the overestimating leads to kind of roadway mitigation that then is counter to kind of people potentially walking or biking in the area, that's no good. The other thing too is that for housing, for sites that have housing, often the pushback locally is that this is going to create too much traffic. And so if we're overestimating the trips for sites with housing, again, that adds kind of fuel to local opposition for these sites and the desire to kind of scale them back. So again, I think getting these numbers right is really important. And I think, to me, this is kind of the beginning of this kind of thinking and research, and I think we need to do more here. Yeah, David, I think raising those what those implications are is really important.
David Gozes.
Yeah, so I think, David, you were able to flesh out exactly my point. But also, probably these estimates were all made before the pandemic for all of these projects, I would guess, whereas the actual observations were made during this weird sort of changing by month sometime pandemic. So I don't know. I think we should keep that in mind, and I would not be surprised at all if we, at some point in the future, see this orange line, the observed trips, go over the estimated trips once, we get more to, further beyond the pandemic, and more occupancy and more back to a normal.
Thank you, David. Daniel Amstutz.
Sorry, Chair, if you don't mind, I just want to clarify David Croz's question. So actually, I think, David, you're introducing a really good other aspect of this work, and thinking about how long-term trip making behavior might change based on the experience of the pandemic. But actually, all of these TMRs were from pre-2020, correct, Drashti? I think you're unmuted, Drashti.
Oh, okay. I was looking for the mute button. Yes, these all observations are before pandemic. In fact, these all projects are completed before pandemic, so it does not have any pandemic effects on it.
Okay, so that's good to know. Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to, I guess, give a second to what Eric was saying just a minute ago about, really the interplay about when perhaps like the sort of mitigation or the assumption about the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, I would say, about people that, well, you have a new development, you assume it's going to create more vehicle traffic, and so you mitigate for that, you add the turn lanes, you make, and in many ways the design of these spaces are also automobile centered, so that it's actually not comfortable to walk there because you have to walk across a giant parking lot, without any kind of protection or separation, or there's no, the bike, you have to expand the roadway in front of it and there's no bike lanes on it or anything to really help you get there. So the only, sort of safe and comfortable way to actually get to these places is by car if you're in an urban or, a more urban area, or even transit users, so there's, I think part of it is kind of the bias that's given to, every single development is going to make, this automobile traffic, and we have to prepare for all of that often at the expense of other things or other ways of getting to these places. So it's sort of, I just want to say there's an interplay there that I think should be included in kind of all this that does make it, again, very complex to understand the behavior and the choices that people make when it comes to getting to a specific point, because you'd say, well, I'm going to walk to this place because it's close by and it's, there's a sidewalk to get there. And so it's not that hard and it's not far away, but I'm not going to walk to this other place because, there is no sidewalk, or it's really uncomfortable, even though I live, like a half mile away or a quarter of a mile away. Like those kinds of other pieces of the network that kind of impact the rest of the like how people access those places. So anyway, I think I would just say that I think it's really difficult to sort of sum up in a single number, like, well, it's going to make this many trips because, we're trying to sort of winnow down or sort of filter all these factors into one single number, and it's not that simple.
And Ellen.
Oh, thanks for this, Drashti, and thanks for the interesting conversation that's ensuing here. I work for CTPS. I helped a little bit with this project, and the comment that I want to make, or the observation, is that I think in a way, geography is destiny for a particular development. And I think, to me, what I'm seeing here is that more research is required, because if we're looking at something that's a development that's in a very urbanized area with a lot of access to transit, it could be treated in a particular way. And if we're looking at a development that's in a suburban or rural setting with not a lot of access to transit, it should be treated in a different way. So I think there's room for many different approaches to trip generation, and I think this helps us get down the road to a place, a better place. That's my comment.
Leonard Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I haven't been as active on this great piece of reporting because I just haven't had time to read as close as I'd like. So I'm just going to ask a basic question. The projections, do they come with error bars?
Do they come with what?
Error bars. Error bars. I mean, so I'm looking at the chart that's up now, and so the on the left side with the daily projections, since there's a projection, I imagine that it would have an error estimate around it. So do they come with error bars? Or I mean, they're not in the graph, but do we have like a sense of the range through which the line or the dots exist?
No, I don't. I think the answer is no. People estimate trips. It's an estimate. Everybody knows it's wrong. Okay. Nobody actually expects that Chestnut Hill will yield, that looks like to me like 13,800 vehicle trips. Nobody believes the count's going to be 13,800, but you need an estimate, right?
Right.
It's the best estimate. And yes, there is some, I'm sure there is some range of highs and lows bounding it, but it is reported as this is the estimated trip generation.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yep. Brad?
Thanks, Chair. Last comments, and I'm eager to hear the MBTA toolkit presentation, so I appreciate everybody's robust dialogue here. So just a couple of things. Anybody who wants to dig deeper, please do feel free to reach out to me, the City of Somerville, representing the inner core, but also all of you, right? We're all in this together, all sub-regions. Mass DOT has a standard process for transportation impact study that is a feature of the MPA process. City of Somerville and others have custom versions of that, and I think that we're all committed, agencies, municipalities, et cetera, to process improvements. And so again, this work helps. But the last thing I want to say, Chair, for all municipal members in particular, is that remember, we're in budget season. Our municipal governments and budgets are constrained structurally in Massachusetts. We have 3 sources of revenue to do all the things that we're wanting, right? Local taxes, fees and fines, and state aid. Responsible development mitigation is a way for our communities to achieve our goals related to sustainability, equity, safety, reducing local tax burdens. And so, David, your point earlier about sometimes the wrong mitigation being assessed to private investment is meaningful for us, because any dollar that a private investor or developer is investing to replace a traffic signal is a dollar that they're not necessarily going to be investing to upgrading a local public space or park, to supporting a workforce development or public education program that's based in mitigating the impacts of their development, small business support, affordable housing, sewer and stormwater upgrades. The private sector helps all of us pay for these things. And it's really incumbent on us to make sure that we are right-sizing our understanding of the impacts and mitigation we assess for local projects, as well as projects of statewide and regional significance through the MEPA process. I'm really excited to see where we can all take this work going, going forward over these next few years. So thanks again for everybody's robust discussion today. Look forward to following up.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to add in a little bit about the city's kind of custom version, as Brad referred to, as far as how we do transportation impact analysis for development review, which I live every day, all day. So we have always kind of taken the approach that the ITE trip generation rates, convert those into really person trip rates. And it's all about then splitting it by mode shares. And we have very specific mode shares by neighborhood to really get to the important questions of the other mode trip generations. And we've really, since we've done Go Boston 2030, which I think folks may know have very aggressive mode share goals for where we want to be, we now have development teams analyzing their future build conditions based on those mode share goals, which drastically reduce driving alone, drastically increasing transit and biking and walking trips. And then from that, we are able to plan for and customize our mitigation more on what we think are the modes we want to shift more towards, obviously, transit, walking, biking. And so we're now really have kind of swung the pendulum where, 20 years ago, we were really focusing on, oh my God, we got to mitigate for all this traffic. And now we've really changed the way we do things, that most of our mitigation is now focused on improving the transit network, improving our bike and ped network. And we're having these development teams do their analysis based on where we want to go with our mode share goals. And so those are go even further beyond our kind of defined mode shares that we have on existing conditions for neighborhoods, which today are already often very high on alternative modes. And we even take that a step further by having them project it based on our aggressive mode share goals that shift to alternative modes. So that's kind of a quick overview of how we've customized how we do our transportation impact analysis for development review. And this work, which I've been, had the pleasure of helping out a bit with and working with Drashti and the rest of CTPS is really, really helpful in moving towards a better way to do things, a better way to do our sort of development review and transportation impact analysis. So I think it's a great help, and looking forward to continuing to develop this work and refine it. So thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Matt Moran.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Matt Moran with the Boston Transportation Department. Just to back up what Jim and Brad were saying, as we think through development review, as we think through where public dollars, private dollars are going in the transportation network, having this data to sort of back up and reflect sort of the building of the city that we want for the future, like the more sustainable, the more bike, ped, transit-friendly city, and sort of focusing away from those dollars going towards additional highway, roadway infrastructure, I think is going to be key in helping us make the case with developers and community members. So thanks very much for this work, everyone. Really, really appreciate it.
Ryan King.
Thanks, David. And I do agree the work that Boston can do, and that Somerville and other municipalities to a lesser extent can do in this area is great. But There's also 94 other towns in the Boston MPO that don't have that staff capacity. And this is where I believe that CTPS and this work can and should come into play, especially in the other inner core communities where they are seeing this development. Watertown has exploded recently, for instance. Quincy, and again, here in Brookline, which is just my personal experience, we don't have this trip generation capacity at all. We abut Boston on three sides, and there's development happening on all three of those sides. So again, just wanted to reiterate what I said earlier and urge CTPS to keep going with this and develop a tool that can be used by those communities that don't have the funding that Boston has, that Somerville has from their development, which is they do phenomenal work, and I think they would agree that this is work that could and should be done in all communities that have development like this and have to do this analysis. So again, I would appreciate it if folks could come back in 6 months with an update on where we are and how it's going, and just to reiterate that we need this regionally. So thank you very much.
Melissa Tentaklis.
I just wanted to kind of add the comment earlier, in terms of contextualizing this for the other communities that are kind of more structured on the kind of suburban model, that, CTPS continues to look at the, how this affects and kind of sometimes gets reinforced in these suburban kind of locations. What happens is it's all about the trip, trip generation, and these parcels get developed with just looking at the traffic still on just the cars, and it's not being, I feel like the analysis doesn't allow what's adjacent to it necessarily, even in particular in a suburban setting. So I don't know how that's being looked at as well. So maybe if they could answer that, and then, as they're moving forward, how this can help the suburban format connect more. So I don't know if that's really in this study necessarily, but I know what I see is that, a community without the resources like Brian, they'll just go to the basic numbers. It's all super traffic driven by car, and you're not getting any better place with the walkability or biking, even basic pedestrian connection. So that's kind of, I just like listening to this. It makes sense when you're in more urban settings, but out here, I feel like it's very difficult to see how some of this work can kind of apply and help us get to a better place.
Marty, Josti, anybody want to handle that one?
Guidance on where to continue the work, and especially where there is the greatest need. Certainly in our approach, we're thinking about how can we improve our travel demand model and also provide some general guidance. But I think these are really, I really appreciate the suggestions around developing a more purpose-built tool, not, just like, okay, it's travel demand model or ITE, but I think something in between makes a lot of sense. And certainly I want to follow up with several folks who have raised these, and let's keep talking about it. And I think that should be one of the the support products that obviously the MPO would benefit from. So something that I think CTPS and my team we can certainly prioritize as a complement to these other tools that we have there. So I hope that, thank you, and we will keep pushing on it.
Thanks, Marty. Thanks, everybody. What's next? Oh, great job, Josh, by the way. What's next on the agenda? Oh, presentation on MBTA Bus Priority and Reliability Toolkit by Eric Berkman and Teresa Carr. Whenever you're ready, Eric.
Hi there. Thanks for having us today. I enjoyed the discussion on the trip generation stuff. A lot of this stuff are things that we're talking about with our bus priority projects as well, in terms of, how accurate are our assumptions and how accurate is our analysis as we go into these roadway reallocation projects that help reinforce the multimodalism and the alternative transportation, which is a term that I'm not always super wild about. But anyway, so we're here today to talk about this document that we're pulling together that will hopefully help cities design and implement bus priority facilities in cooperation with us that meet a standard look and feel across the region so that car drivers and bus operators and everybody who uses the streets, whether they're using the bus or not, can kind of know what to expect in terms of consistency as they move throughout our different communities, which of course are very connected to each other economically, socially, et cetera. So I have Teresa Carr with me here today as well. She's our consultant who's on the project from Nelson Nygaard. So they're doing all the hard work and I'm just sort of reading things occasionally. So, and I'm Eric Berkman. I'm the Director of Transit Priority for the T. I think I didn't introduce myself. All right, so we can get started. Let's go to the next slide. So as you all know, our projects are a little bit different. Next slide. Even though we own the service, you all own the streets. So we have to work together in order to get these projects through. We have to collaborate very closely in order to deliver on any of our projects, which is the whole point of the toolkit. So we want to provide some more consistent and clearer guidance to municipalities within our service area on kind of the benefits of these projects and how we work together and how we design them, right? So one thing that I want to add, if you have been in the ICC meetings recently, you probably have seen this presentation already. It'll look pretty familiar to you. And we'll get to the project schedule and timeline a little bit later, but basically we're trying to expand our outreach a little bit to make people throughout the state, throughout the entire MPO area really, familiar with kind of the work that we're doing in case it's pertinent to things that they're working on, even if you're not exactly within the MBTA bus service area. So we're open to any feedback and comments, which we'll get to a little bit later. But if you were in the ICC presentation recently, this is going to look pretty familiar to you. All right, next slide. So before we get into it, in case you're not familiar with the Transit Priority Group, we kind of came out of the 2016 CTPS, or the basis for our group came out of the 2016 CTPS prioritization of dedicated bus lanes study, which really identified areas of delay in our bus system and areas of like high passenger volume on the roadway network. So we were founded in 2019, and with a Bar Foundation grant, and in 2021 we were moved over to the regular T budget. So we're here, you know, to stay, I guess, as long as anybody's really here to stay. And we're a highly collaborative group, but I think the biggest key is that we're driven by implementation. We're really focused on actually getting the projects implemented rather than doing like a study of what's the best project necessarily, right? So using this data focus, we collaborate with y'all to actually get the projects built on the roadway. Okay, next slide. So in 2015, we had 2.8 lane miles of bus lane that was mostly Silver Line. And as of the end of calendar 21, we had 25.6 miles and 12 municipalities in the program. Most of that has been since 2019, 2018. So we really are proud of this, and you all should be proud of it as well, because as I said, this is collaborative. You know, without the vision of the different municipal leaders and our cooperation at MBTA, we couldn't have achieved this. And this is really a very, very significant expansion of the bus priority program. So good on all of us. This is just a list of kind of the recent expansion, or, you know, the recent projects. You can see there, we really have a pretty wide cross section of municipalities included here. And these will be posted if you want to get into it a little bit later, but we can go to the next slide. And I think this is where I'm handing it over to Teresa.
Actually, I think you have a couple more slides.
Oh, all right, great. So sorry. So anyway, the reason that part of the toolkit, it sort of steps through why do we need transit priority and kind of how do we address transit priority on the streets. So as you know, we're really, the real key here is an improvement in the variability and improvement in the reliability of the transit trip. So if you, even though you may only save 2 minutes of average travel time, if it reduces the variability by 20 minutes, that means you can leave your house 20 minutes later, because you're probably not planning your trip on the average travel time, but rather the 90th percentile travel time. You want to make sure that you have enough time, because when you leave your house, you don't know if it's a good travel time day or a bad travel time day. So you need to plan for the bad travel time day. And sometimes you arrive at work early, and sometimes you arrive right on time. So what we're trying to do is kind of bring the typical day and the worst travel time day closer together so you can leave your house later. And we realized this, Matt Moran will probably remember on the Bright Nav project, we found that the average travel time improved by like 2 or 3 minutes. But when we surveyed people, they were saying, I'm saving 20, 25 minutes. And we realized they're communicating back the reliability improvement rather than the average travel time improvement. So that's very important. So we're hoping to provide really specific information on how to implement things like lane widths, things like how to orient the bus stop and different other facilities on the roadway that can be a little bit easier to understand. We've heard the criticism from some municipal staff that depending on who they talk to at the MBTA, they might get a different answer on what really we accept for a roadway treatment or don't accept. So part of the goal of this is to kind of have that one source that we can put on the website and say, look, like refer to this document, similar to like what we do with the NACDO Transit Street Design Guide, but more local context, local relevance, that you can really have a little bit more consistency in the guidance that we're providing and how to design our streets where we have bus service. So, and then this is kind of building on the report from MAPC from last summer or earlier in the spring. I don't remember exactly when it was, but in kind of picking up from that appendix where it talks about the different ways to implement. This report really detailed some of the earlier transit priority projects in the region and how we work together with cities in order to deliver them. So now this will be, but it kind of stopped short of a lot of design elements. So this will be providing these design elements that are important to the designers as they're working toward implementation. So I think now is where I hand it over to Teresa. Sorry, I was a little bit jumped the gun on that one. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you everybody for giving us the time today. Really appreciate the opportunity to walk through the work that we are doing and where we're headed and to hear some feedback from all of you. So I want to talk a little bit about the toolkit components. And there are 3 buckets that we're addressing in the toolkit. We've kind of organized them around priority along bus lanes, priorities at the signals and the signs, and priorities at the bus stops themselves. And for each toolkit, so we did a survey of best practices as part of this process, and we broke it down into some typical components that we applied in the toolkit for this region. And specifically, one is identifying where the challenges are that need to be addressed. This is telling the why, right? Why do we want to invest in transit priority? Provide detailed priority strategies in as much detail as possible while still being friendly to a wide audience, including technical and non-technical audience members. And then third is a focus on implementation guidance so that you can take the toolkit and really have a sense of what you want to do next. Like, what are the immediate steps that I can take to make this investment happen? And here are some examples. This is some visual style that we used as inspiration in the development of the toolkit here. This is an example from King County Metro. We also looked at TransLink in Vancouver, British Columbia. We looked at BART in the San Francisco Bay Area. But typical toolkits begin with framing, and that's an introduction to the toolkit, the purpose, the challenges, and the benefits of speed and reliability in as graphic a manner as possible. And then looking at strategies. So here, this is another example from the Seattle area, but looking at an overview of a strategy, what the objectives are that are being addressed, as graphically as possible using photos, case studies, best practices, looking at the benefits, but also looking at the challenges and the operational considerations. So you'll see I have a slide on a typical treatment that we've developed for our toolkit here in the region. And we're trying to be as specific as possible around what are the local challenges, what are the local opportunities that we find in the Boston metropolitan area. Looking at coordination and partnerships, some alternatives and some companion strategies. So what treatments complement one another, where you might see one, you might see another, and providing local examples. The implementation guidance, again, is as graphic and compelling as possible, and really show how the strategies fit together. And I'd like to go through a little bit on the layout of the toolkit as has been developed so far. So here's our table of contents. We do have an implementation focus for the toolkit, and the graphic that you see on the right of the slide really looks at the project life cycle. So the earlier presentation was talking about, what you see when you go back and you monitor a development that has already been constructed, and that monitoring piece and that improvement upon what you find when you do that monitoring is really important, and you'll see that here. We start with the identification of the problem, the diagnostics. We want to define the context that you see in the planning world specific to the municipalities in this region. The involvement of stakeholders through engagement and coordination, the selection of the right treatments, the implementation, and then that evaluation step. So the introductory chapters, this is an example graphic developed for this toolkit. The introductory chapters do lay the context of why we're doing this, why it would be important to invest in transit priority. And we do this because we want to attract as broad an audience as possible. We want to be creating a toolkit that is of interest to members of the general public, to elected officials, to municipal staff, a broad audience. And we discuss the benefits of transit priority treatments in terms of travel time benefits and reliability benefits. Making the case for bus priority, what Eric had shared before was just a broad example of making the case. And this is an example showing the specifics, graphics that we've developed for this toolkit. More on making the case for bus priority. And then again, in as graphic as possible, breaking down what can be some complicated concepts. And you see two graphics here on this slide. The one on the left is talking about the importance of making space for bus transit priority, even if you might be in a condition where you don't see traffic congestion today. And so we try and lay out as friendly as possible why it's important to dedicate the right of way, dedicate that space today so that you can see long-term benefits as traffic may increase over time, as development increases over time, that you have set aside that space, as Jim was saying in the earlier presentation, of saying, by dedicating this space, I am making this consistent with my community's priorities. Now, the graphic on the right of the slide is a work in progress, but this is trying to describe how transit signal priority works. And this can be a bit of a nuanced topic. And this is just an example of the graphics that we are developing. And it's not just Nelson Nygaard on our team. We have McMahon and we have UTIL helping with technical development of concepts and with the graphic capabilities. But the ability to break down these very technical concepts so that they are easier to understand. The treatment sheets themselves are what we...
If I could just add one thing, if you could go back, just
Okay.
that I think is really interesting, is we really have spent, to give everybody an idea of the level that we're kind of taking this to, we really spent a lot of time even talking about the contrast of the traffic signals and the poles and the cabinet, and how do we really call out these elements and concepts that are a little bit less clear. So I want to, and another thing too is, as you look in these illustrations, you might notice that they kind of look like a street that you could see in Greater Boston, but not so specific that you could localize it to a specific intersection, right? So we're really, Nelson Nygaard, to their credit and to UTIL's credit, have really taken a lot of care to make sure that this can be, you know, regionally specific and make all of our stakeholders feel like they can kind of see these treatments on their own streets. So sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to add that little piece in.
No, I'm glad you did. The treatment sheets themselves are what we call the heart of the matter. And this is the bulk of like the middle of our toolkit. And these are actual cut sheets. They're either 1-page spreads or 2-page spreads. We have a couple that I think are a little bit bigger than that. But they break down both in illustrations and then in narrative as well, what all of these pieces that you see. The overview of the treatment, the benefits and the challenges, the considerations as you go into implementation, the complementary treatments, examples, see it in action, as well as the schematic rendering and the design guidelines. And here is an example, just one of the treatment sheets. We have about, I think, 24 in total, broken down into the bus lane and bus stops chapters. But here, you can see the illustration on the right. As Eric mentioned, this is a 3D model that we have of the Boston area. So this is the specific intersection, but we're trying to generalize it so that it's not too specific. You could see it at any, you know, in a variety of places in the Boston metro area. But you can, we provide the examples. Some of this is all built out, and then the complementary treatments is just a mock-up. As we finish the toolkit, we'll add that information in kind of at the end. And then I think I turn it back over to Eric.
Yep. So as we said earlier, we're kind of mid-process in this. So we already, you know, last fall and winter, we had identified kind of what are the broader concepts, what are the treatment sheets that we want to provide. And right now we're, as you can see with this pink line on the screen here, we're right in the middle of kind of preparing the content, reviewing the content, and engaging stakeholders. So as you notice here, we have some overlap between stakeholder engagement and preparing the content. That means that as we have more stuff that we're ready to share, that we'll be re-engaging you all probably on a more individual basis, based on kind of where our bus network runs and where we have the most transit priority projects, to make sure that we're really offering something that we can all stand behind, rather than it being kind of like a top-down MBTA. This is what we say we want. So get ready for some more engagement as we go into the summer. And then this summer, fall, we're hoping to finalize and then kind of publish for a broader audience, hopefully around the time of the NACDO conference that's coming, as a nice little, you know, welcome to Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, and MBTA area. We've developed this toolkit. So we're hoping that we can get to that level of timeline, but we'll kind of see how long the review is going to take, right? So the layout of the toolkit is basically stepping through kind of some implementation, you know, background on why this stuff is important, some planning context and implementation pieces, in addition to the actual, not quite engineering guidance, but rather like planning, engineering guidance, and that kind of gray area of how to actually design the facilities. One piece that I think is interesting is many of you are familiar with our bus stop design guidelines. We're hoping to implement these more into this toolkit as well, so that we have a similar look and feel for most of the streetscape elements of operating the bus service, so that we aren't referring kind of between the transit priority toolkit and the bus stop design guideline. But we're not exactly sure how that's going to be implemented yet. So that's another piece that we're going to be working out in the coming months. So recognizing that many of the communities in here aren't really in the core of the MBTA bus system, we still are interested in your thoughts and feelings and kind of and how you think this process can serve not only Greater Boston, but others in, you know, New England and Massachusetts and the MPO area on, you know, what types of treatments and sort of what guidance. We recognize that, you know, agencies not only in our region, but across the country will look to MBTA for, you know, how are we implementing things? How are we working with our cities? You know, and so we just want to make sure that we're not kind of really getting something wrong or leaving something out completely, even if it doesn't necessarily apply directly to the MBTA system. But we're interested in feedback on this. So kind of as we go through the process, and maybe there's some questions right now, really feel free to reach out to me or reach out to Teresa, and provide some thoughts and feedback on the process or on the documents produced. So.
Thank you, Eric.
Go ahead.
Brian King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Eric and Teresa. Great presentation. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. As you may know, I tried to do this 10 years ago in my town, and while I was at the T, like 5 years ago, tried to get it going. So congrats to you for advancing it this far. This is amazing, and certainly something that the region needs. I guess one area where I would just suggest you put in the toolkit is around enforcement. And I know that that is hard, and I know that that is not necessarily the job of the authority, but it can be, or something about how municipalities can help with enforcement would be great. And finally, two more things. Wanted to obviously I'll reach out to you, Eric. I want to invite you to come and speak to my my Rapid Transit Committee members who are all the bus communities. And there is also legislation that will probably be refiled in January to allow the T to do automatic enforcement of bus lane scofflaws by camera. So lots to work together on. Thank you. This is great. Please keep going and keep pushing. Thank you.
Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the great part about being the Ride Oversight Committee representative on the Advisory Council is that the Advisory Council is really very much into transit, and this is going to be right up their alley. So I'd like to invite both of you to come and talk to the Advisory Council sometime in the next couple of months when input can have the greatest value. So a couple of comments and a question. Maybe suggestions. So I would suggest with those signal boxes, mention that they can be great places for art. It'll appeal to the arts community, and getting them to support a project like this is huge. I mean, it sounds like a small thing, but it can really go a long way when talking to especially electeds in towns. The second is to also mention that the bus priority is good for equity, it's good for sustainability, and it's good for the climate, and that has a broad appeal, and it has a nice element of being true. And the question is, do you discuss maintenance costs at all when you talk with communities? Because you did mention talking about the costs. I mean, is this maintenance in part of that equation?
Yeah, so we are really focused on like the street design. So to the extent, and this kind of applies to enforcement too. So for example, like a center running bus lane, as we've seen on Columbus Ave, is the design like lends to a little bit better, even like self-enforcement, right? So, and same thing with the maintenance stuff. So as we're talking about the treatment sheets, we consider, enforcement and maintenance pieces as they pertain to the design, but we don't necessarily say, or we won't necessarily say in the toolkit, MBTA will maintain X, Y, and Z, the city maintains X, Y, and Z, or MBTA enforces in this way and the city enforces in this way, but rather how do those, how do those items kind of inform the design, right? So the maintenance piece is sort of like a city by city separate effort, and the enforcement piece is also a little bit of a separate effort, because we really want to keep the toolkit focused on those design elements rather than the more administrative pieces.
Okay, thank
Brad Rawson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Eric, Teresa, and all the team that has been working on these issues. I want to offer a bridge building comment, and then going back to something Melissa from Burlington mentioned earlier. I think it's important that this board recognize that the best practices being captured in this technical report are not uniquely applicable to urban communities. They're not uniquely applicable to MBTA high-frequency bus corridors. They can be applied effectively for RTAC and rubber tire shuttle services, as Len Diggins just acknowledged and referenced. But also the technologies as they emerge are becoming more compatible between traditional emergency vehicle preemption and bus preemption. We are currently working with Eric's staff and our local fire department to ensure that when we have standard requirements for traffic signal upgrades, we invest in the right technology to recognize our ambulances, our fire apparatus, as well as MBTA buses. So I just want to make sure that folks don't tune out and think just because you don't have a bus with a 20-minute headway, it doesn't mean that this report is not for you and for your community. Second and last point, Chair, is a question for the team, for Eric. I think that it's important to recognize that this board had a long discussion last week about the opportunities for designing on-street bus infrastructure as part of state-funded or state-managed projects on state roads. In Somerville, we've had a couple of great participation projects with our partners at Mass DOT, getting treatments for bus lanes on specific state highways. You all have worked on the Tobin Bridge and many other important projects. Eric, can you talk a little bit about the dialogue that you've had with our partners at the DCR and Mass DOT to ensure types of treatments on what we think of as traditional state highways? Thank you very much.
Yes. I think there was a question at the end about how we've coordinated with the state agencies, right? So, we haven't really started a lot of direct engagement one-on-one with state agencies or municipalities. We've been more focused on presenting to these larger groups at this point. So our engagement really with DCR, with MassDOT, has been on like a project by project basis. And I would say that we're working towards some of those implementation issues together. And it's just a different, it's just a different process a little bit as compared to municipalities. And I know we've had with the McGrath project and some of the shared streets projects in Washington Street, we have been working through some of that process with MassDOT districts specifically. So I think it's kind of, they'll be engaged as part of the toolkit, and we'll make sure that, their comments are heard as well. But we haven't really done that direct one-on-one engagement with them as of yet with MassDOT or DCR. So, but that is certainly on the docket. That's a good thing to bring up. Thanks.
Other questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Teresa.
Thanks again for having us.
Yep. Next item on the agenda. Oh, Melissa, you have something?
Sorry, I was late on that. Yeah, I just wanted to thank them also because I think what I like to think about as some of these suburban communities start to do more infill, anticipating and preparing for this kind of bus priority lanes for more suburban communities that may not have, the headway we're talking about, may not see that as a real kind of reliable use, can be enhanced as we think about this with more infill and planning ahead for before it's congested and too hard to deal with. So I like that comment, and I wanted to just share that with you guys.
Thank you. Brian, you got something you want to say before we go on to member items?
I have a member item.
Oh, okay. Now we're on to member items. Brian King.
Thank you. Wanted to bring up something I brought up last week, which is consideration of moving the format from these virtual meetings from this format that we're in now to a webinar format, which would allow members and those elevated to mute and unmute themselves. I think a good example is just what happened to Teresa, where she wanted to come in and couldn't because not because the chair is at all delinquent on seeing things or calling on people, but just because there's a lot of folks on here and stuff happens. So I wanted to just ask you, Mr. Chair, and you know, the folks, the powers that be, you know, consider moving to a webinar format. You know, you can elevate panelists, you can not elevate panelists, et cetera. You know, I think we're all adults here, and I think it would be better for the body moving forward. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. I'll talk to Tegan about it. I don't actually have I haven't actually thought about it, Brian. So let me just talk to Tegan and see what it would entail. Other member items? Seeing none, can I get a motion to a second and a second to adjourn? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Brian Kane.
Brian Kane moves to adjourn, Mr. Chair.
Is there a second? Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Ipsett seconds.
Thank you. Without objection, we are adjourned. Have a great week, everybody. Bye.